January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Belgium. The snow falls in silence. Not the peaceful silence of winter mornings, but the hollow quiet that follows artillery fire. Silence so complete, it rings in the ears like tinnitus. Sergeant Michael Torres crouches in a foxhole lined with pine branches and frozen earth, his breath forming clouds that hang in the air before dissipating into nothing. His hands numb inside wool gloves that haven't been dry in 3 days. Grip a twisted piece of metal salvaged from a destroyed German half-track. It is sharp where it broke, dull where fire scorched it black. He turns it over, studying it with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. Around him, 5 other men huddle close, their faces grey with cold and exhaustion. Their eyes fixed on this piece of scrap as though it was salvation itself. It is, in a way, for 6 days. Torres and his unit remnants of the 101st Airborne scattered during the German offensive have been cut off from command. 6 days without orders, without resupply, without the voice of command crackling through radio static to tell them they are not alone. The Germans call this operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. A desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. The Americans will come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. But in this moment, Torres knows none of that. He knows only that his -300 Seychelles rupees radio the lifeline that connects scattered units across the chaos of battle. Took shrapnel 2 days ago and died with a sound like a sigh, and so he sits in the snow with a piece of a German vehicle, wires stripped from a fence post, and an idea that seems impossible to understand. What Torres is attempting in that frozen hole requires understanding what the radio meant to the American way of war. The United States entered the Second World War as an industrial colossus, a nation that produced more steel, more oil, more aircraft, more of everything than any other country on earth. But what truly separated American forces from their enemies was not merely abundance, it was communication. While German units often relied on motorcycle couriers racing between positions, while Japanese commanders issued orders that took hours to reach frontline troops, American soldiers spoke to each other across miles in real time. The -300 Seychelles rupees, introduced in 1943, was a marvel, a frequency-modulated radio that could transmit voice clearly up to 3 miles, sometimes more in good conditions. It weighed 35 pounds with its battery pack. It was weatherproofed, shock-resistant, engineered with the kind of redundancy that American manufacturing excelled at. But engineering has limits, and shrapnel respects no design. When radios failed in the chaos of the Bulge, they failed. Often American soldiers faced a choice. They could go silent, operating blind in a battle where German positions shifted hourly, where friendly artillery needed coordinates, where evacuation of wounded depended on calling for help. Or they could improvise. The American military did not formally teach improvised radio construction. There were no field manuals titled Building Communications Equipment from Battlefield Debris, but American soldiers had grown up in a nation where radios were everywhere, where ham radio enthusiasts numbered in the tens of thousands, where boys learned electronics in basements and garages because technology was not mysterious, it was participatory. Torres had worked at a Zenith radio factory in Chicago before the war. He wound coils, soldered connections, tested circuits. That knowledge, filed away in muscle memory and intuition, now becomes the difference between survival and silence. The men gathered in that foxhole did not expect this. None of them did. When they had shipped out from Camp Tokoa, when they had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier, when they had liberated French villages to cheers and thrown wine, they expected to fight. They expected cold and fear and death. But they did not expect this particular kind of desperation. The desperation of having everything the world's most powerful industrial nation could provide, and then having it break. German soldiers, by contrast, had lived with scarcity for years. By 1945, the Wehrmacht scavenged constantly, cannibalizing broken vehicles to keep others running, using captured weapons because their own factories could not keep pace with losses. Japanese forces in the Pacific had elevated scarcity to a philosophy, teaching soldiers to view deprivation as spiritual purification. American soldiers expected their equipment to work. When it didn't, they expected replacement. The abundance of American logistics, the seemingly endless convoys of trucks, the supply depots stacked with crates, the replacement radios waiting in warehouses had created a kind of faith. And now that faith was being tested in the snow. Torres spreads out his materials on a canvas shelter half. Besides the German half-track metal, he has 30 feet of telephone wire scavenged from a bombed farmhouse, 2 D-cell batteries from a flashlight, a broken knife blade, capacitors pulled from the destroyed -300 Seychelles rupees, and a vacuum tube miraculously intact, cradled like a relic. One of the men, Private First Class David Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, contributes a small toolset he carried through the jump. Another, Corporal James Wodakowski from Detroit, offers a magnifying glass he used for reading maps. They are building something from nothing, or more precisely, building something from the wreckage of 2 armies' industrial capacity. The irony is not lost on Torres. He is using German steel to call for American help. Improvised radio networks were not invented in the Ardennes. They emerged wherever American forces found themselves cut off, wherever standard equipment failed, wherever the need to communicate outweighed the impossibility of means. In the Pacific, Marines on Guadalcanal had rigged antennas from Japanese barbed wire. In North Africa, tankers created intercoms using field telephone components and wire coat hangers. The practice was widespread enough that some units, particularly engineering battalions, carried junk boxes, footlockers filled with spare parts, wire tubes, and components specifically for field repairs, and modifications that went beyond official maintenance procedures. What made the Ardennes different was scale and urgency. The German offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, caught American forces in a moment of perceived security. Units were spread thin along the supposedly quiet Ardennes front, some resting after months of combat, others newly arrived and inexperienced. When 3 German Army's 28 divisions, more than 400,000 men struck through fog and snow, they shattered American lines in dozens of places. Communications infrastructure, already tenuous in the forested hills, collapsed. Telephone lines were cut. Radio operators were killed or captured. Command posts were overrun. And in that chaos, isolated American units found themselves fighting not one battle but hundreds of small, desperate battles, each one dependent on whether they could call for help, coordinate with nearby units, or simply know where the enemy was. The official U.S. Army history of the Ardennes campaign records that communications failures contributed to more tactical confusion than any other single factor in the battle's opening days. Units fired on each other. Artillery barrages landed on friendly positions. Commanders issued orders to units that had already been destroyed. And through it all, the weather-thick fog, heavy snow, temperatures plunging below zero made visual communication impossible and radio transmission unreliable. Into this void stepped men like Torres, men who understood that a radio was not magic but physics, not irreplaceable but rebuildable. He works through the night, his hands shaking from cold and concentration. The basic principle is simple, almost absurdly so. A radio transmitter is nothing more than an oscillator that generates electromagnetic waves at a specific frequency, modulated by voice input, amplified, and sent through an antenna. A receiver captures those waves, filters the desired frequency, amplifies the signal, and converts it back to sound. Simple in theory. Extraordinarily difficult with frozen fingers and scrap metal. Torres fashions a crude oscillator circuit using the salvaged capacitors and the vacuum tube. The tube, a 6L6 beam power pented, was designed for audio amplification in the -300 Seychelles rupees. In its original role, it operated in a carefully calibrated circuit with precise voltage. Here, powered by flashlight batteries providing a fraction of the required voltage, it must be coaxed into function through creative wiring. Torres wraps wire around the German metal to create an inductor coil. The metal, being steel rather than iron, is not ideal. It has higher resistance, will generate more heat, will be less efficient, but it will work. It must work. The antenna is another problem. Radio waves propagate best when the antenna length matches the wavelength of the transmission frequency. The -300 Seychelles rupees operated on frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz, meaning optimal antenna length should be around 5 feet. Torres has 30 feet of wire. He uses 20 feet of it to create a vertical whip antenna, tied to a broken tree branch wedged into the foxhole's edge, with the remaining 10 feet spread on the ground as a crude ground plane by dawn. He has something that looks like a science project assembled by a child. Exposed connections wrapped in canvas, components held together with friction and prayer. A microphone, the one piece of the -300 Seychelles rupees that survived intact, connected by 3 wires to the oscillator. The batteries, wired in series to boost voltage, their terminals wrapped in rubber cut from a canteen cover. Will it work? Chen asks. His voice is hoarse from days of shouting orders over gunfire. Torres stares at his creation. In Chicago, in the clean fluorescent light of the Zenith factory, with calibrated equipment and standardized parts, building a radio was engineering. Here, it is alchemy. Only one way to find out, he says. He keys the microphone. Nothing happens. He adjusts a connection, keys again. A faint hum emanates from the salvaged speaker they've connected as a test monitor sound. So quiet they have to huddle close to hear it. Torres feels a surge of something that is not quite hope, not yet. He speaks into the microphone. Any station, this is Baker Company, 2nd Battalion. Do you copy? Static answers him. But it is beautiful static, the hiss and crackle of electromagnetic waves propagating through space. The sound of his voice converted to signal and broadcast. Into the winter air, the symbolic weight of that moment. Man speaking into a device made from the wreckage of battle carries meaning beyond its immediate tactical value. American ideology, as articulated in the flood of wartime propaganda. In the speeches of Roosevelt, in the films and posters and songs that saturated the home front, rested on a particular vision of what America represented. It was not merely freedom in an abstract sense, though freedom was invoked constantly. It was the freedom that came from abundance, from possibility, from the idea that scarcity was a solvable problem. European powers had fought over limited resources for centuries. American mythology said there was enough for everyone, that innovation and industry could transcend the zero-sum calculations of the old world. And yet here, in the snow, abundance had failed. The supply lines that stretched back through France to the ports of Normandy, the lines that carried millions of tons of materiel to the front, had been severed by German panzers. The radios that represented American technological superiority lay broken. What remained was not the abundance of supplies, but the abundance of knowledge that diffused. Democratized understanding of technology that came from growing up in a nation where machines were not reserved for elites, but integrated into daily life. German soldiers, many of them technically proficient, understood radio, but German society had approached technology. You were trained for a specific role, given specific knowledge, expected to perform specific functions. The idea of a sergeant building a transmitter from battlefield scrap would have seemed absurd, a violation of the proper order of expertise. Japanese forces, even more rigid in their hierarchies, would have found the concept nearly incomprehensible, but American culture, messy, informal, skeptical of pure authority, had created a generation of soldiers who saw technology as something you could take apart, understand, and rebuild. The ham radio operators who experimented in their spare time, the farm boys who fixed tractors with improvised parts, the factory workers who understood manufacturing tolerances and circuit design not as abstractions, but as things their hands had shaped. Torres keys, the microphone again. Any station, this is Baker Company. We are cut off. Coordinates approximately 5-4-3-8-2-9. We have wounded. Request instructions and support. Still static. But he adjusts the oscillator, turning a scavenged potentiometer that changes the transmission frequency slightly. And suddenly faint, distorted, but unmistakable a voice cuts through. Baker Company, this is regiment. Say again your position. The emotion Torres feels in that moment is not joy, exactly. It is relief so profound it manifests as physical weakness, a trembling that starts in his hands and spreads through his body. Chen claps him on the shoulder. Wojciechowski laughs, a sound that becomes a sob halfway through. They are no longer alone. The voice on the radio, crackling and distant, represents connection to the vast apparatus of American military power. It means coordinates can be passed to artillery. It means medics can be guided to their position. It means they exist again in the military's consciousness, are no longer simply missing, presumed dead, but it means more than survival. In that makeshift radio, assembled from the detritus of industrial war, is a statement about the nature of the conflict itself. This is not a battle between armies alone, but between systems, between ways of organizing knowledge and resources, between philosophies of what human beings are capable of doing. Over the next 72 hours, Torres's radio becomes a lifeline for not just his unit, but for 3 others in the vicinity. Word spreads through the shattered American lines. Baker Company has communications. Units send runners, men who risk German patrols and friendly fire to reach the foxhole where Torres operates his crude transmitter. He takes messages, relays coordinates, passes intelligence about German movements. The radio operates intermittently, the batteries drain quickly, components overheat. Connections fail and must be resoldered with heat from a candle butt. It operates, and it is not alone. Across the Ardennes battlefield, in dozens of frozen holes and shattered buildings, other American soldiers are doing the same thing. A signal corps lieutenant in Bastogne rigs a transmitter using parts from a destroyed German radio and an American field telephone, creating a hybrid device that can reach units 10 miles away. A tank crew outside St. Vith builds an intercom system from components scavenged from 3 different wrecked vehicles, allowing them to coordinate with infantry they cannot see through the fog. A forward artillery observer, his radio destroyed by mortar fire, constructs a crude beacon transmitter that broadcasts a single repeating tone, allowing aircraft to locate his position for supply drops. These improvisations are not officially recorded. They do not appear in after-action reports with the detail that engagements and casualty figures do, but they appear in the margins, in the memoirs written decades later, in oral histories collected by military historians and archivists. The pattern is consistent. American soldiers, faced with communications breakdown, rebuild their networks from scrap. The German military, monitoring American radio frequencies, notes this phenomenon with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. A German signals intelligence report captured after the war describes American communications as anarchic but resilient, lacking centralized discipline but possessing unexpected redundancy. The report's author, a major in the Wehrmacht Communications Service, expresses bewilderment at the American tendency to treat equipment as repairable and replaceable rather than inviolable. Their soldiers, he writes, approach complex technology with the casualness of mechanics rather than the reverence of operators. This casualness, this assumption that technology could be understood and manipulated by anyone with sufficient motivation, was itself a product of American abundance. Not abundance of materials in this particular moment, but abundance of access. Radio technology in Germany was centralized, controlled, its inner workings considered specialist knowledge. In Japan, even more so radio. Ownership itself was restricted, regulated, monitored. But in America, by 1940, there were more than 50 million radio receivers in a nation of 130 million people. Radios were in homes, cars, bars, stores. They were consumer goods, understood to break and be repaired by local technicians or hobbyists. The mystery had been stripped away by ubiquity. Torres operates his transmitter for 11 days. The batteries are replaced twice with supplies dropped by parachute after the weather clears enough for air resupply. He trains 3 other men in basic operation and repair so the radio can function around the clock. He modifies the design twice, improving transmission range by experimenting with antenna configurations, reducing power consumption by adjusting the oscillator circuit. By the end, his crude scrap metal radio is reaching units 15 miles away, a range that approaches the performance of the original SCR 300. On January 28, 1945, the German offensive collapses. Allied forces have held, then counterattacked. The bulge in the American lines begins to contract. Torres's unit is relieved by elements of the Third Army pushing north from Luxembourg. They are given hot food, dry socks, and orders to march to the rear for rest and refit. Torres carefully disassembles his radio, packing the components in a canvas bag. A captain from division signals asks to see it. Torres hands it over. The captain examines it in silence, turning the crude assembly over in his hands, studying the exposed wiring and improvised connections. "Did you document the design?" The captain asks. "No, sir. Just built it. Could you build another?" "With the right parts?" "Yes, sir." The captain nods. He makes a note in a small book he carries. Torres never learns what becomes of that note, whether his design is studied, replicated, or forgotten. It doesn't matter. The radio served its purpose. It allowed voices to reach across the silence of battle. It transformed wreckage into connection. The Battle of the Bulge cost the American military 89,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. It was the bloodiest battle in American military history. A savage winter struggle that tested not just military capability but national will. German losses were higher 100,000 casualties. Losses in tanks and aircraft that could not be replaced. The expenditure of fuel reserves Germany did not possess. The battle broke the Wehrmacht's capacity for offensive action in the West. 4 months later, the war in Europe ended, but the significance of battles is not measured only in casualties and territory. The Ardennes tested something deeper, the question of what happens when systems fail, when abundance proves finite, when the tools of modern war break down in the snow and cold. The American response to that test was improvisation, the application of distributed knowledge and individual initiative to solve collective problems. It was not glorious. It did not appear in the news, but it was profound. The radios built from scrap metal in the winter of 1945 were symbols of something that neither German discipline nor Japanese spiritual fervor could replicate. They represented the idea that knowledge itself was abundant, that technology was not the exclusive domain of specialists, but the common property of anyone who cared to understand it. They represented a culture that valued practical problem-solving over rigid adherence to doctrine, that trusted sergeants to make decisions colonels might make in other armies, that assumed its citizens were capable of more than they had been formally taught. This was America's true advantage, not the factories, though they mattered enormously, not the resources, though they were vast, but the expectation that ordinary people could, when necessary, do extraordinary things, that a factory worker from Chicago could become a radio engineer in a foxhole, that the boundary between user and creator, between soldier and innovator, was permeable. Michael Torres survived the war. He returned to Chicago, to the Zenith factory, where he worked for another 30 years. He never spoke much about the Ardennes, not because the memories were too painful, though they were, because what he had done seemed unremarkable to him. You had a problem. You solved it. That was all. In 1983, a military historian interviewing veterans of the Bulge asked Torres about the improvised radios. Torres, 71 years old by then, smiled. "We just needed to talk to each other," he said. "Couldn't let a little thing like a broken radio stop that. A little thing like a broken radio." In that dismissal, in that casual confidence, is the essence of why the American military succeeded as it did. Not because its soldiers were braver, courage was universal among those who fought. Not because its equipment was perfect equipment, failed constantly, but because its soldiers believed, with a faith born from a culture of abundance and innovation, that obstacles were temporary and solutions were possible. The Germans, who fought in the Ardennes, expected scarcity and discipline to overcome material disadvantage. They expected will to triumph over resources. It was the philosophy that had carried them across Europe in 1940, that had nearly broken the Soviet Union in 1941. But by 1945, that philosophy had exhausted itself. There was no more will to extract, no more discipline to impose, and the material disadvantage had become insurmountable. The Americans who fought in the Ardennes expected their radios to work, and when they didn't, they expected to fix them. That expectation, simple, practical, rooted in a lifetime of experience with technology that could be understood and manipulated, proved more resilient than fanaticism or discipline. It was an expectation born from a society where a boy could take apart a radio in his garage, where knowledge was accessible, where the gap between civilian and engineer was measured in curiosity rather than class. In the end, the improvised radios of the Ardennes were not about technology. They were about connection, the insistence, even in the face of chaos and death, that voices could reach each other, that isolation could be overcome, that the individual was not alone but part of a vast network of mutual support. This was the promise of American democracy, made tangible in wire and metal and broadcast electromagnetic waves. Not equality in the abstract, but equality in capability. Not freedom from hierarchy, but freedom to act within it. Not the absence of scarcity, but the refusal to accept scarcity as permanent. Torres's radio, built from the wreckage of German and American machinery, was a hybrid of enemies, industrial output, turned to the purpose of connection rather than destruction. In that transformation lies a truth about the nature of the conflict. This was not a war to seize resources or impose ideology through force alone. It was a war about what kind of world would emerge from the rubble, one where knowledge and capability were hoarded by elites, or one where they were distributed, accessible, assumed to be the birthright of ordinary people. The frozen forests of the Ardennes hold many ghosts. Soldiers who died calling for help that never came. Soldiers who fought until their ammunition ran out, until the cold took them, until they could fight no more. But they also hold the memory of soldiers who refused to accept silence, who built bridges of electromagnetic waves across the snow, who turned scrap metal into salvation, and in those crude, improvised radios, assembled by frozen hands in desperate hours, is the echo of a larger truth, that freedom is not merely the absence of constraint, but the presence of capability, that abundance is not just material, but intellectual and spiritual, that a nation which trusts its citizens to understand, to create, to solve, such a nation, when tested, reveals a resilience that no amount of discipline or fanaticism can match. The radio in Torres's hands, broadcasting into the winter night, was more than a tool. It was a declaration. It said, "We are here. We endure. We adapt. We will not go silent." And in the end, that declaration, repeated in 1,000 frozen foxholes across the Ardennes, proved more powerful than all the panzers and artillery the German war machine could deploy. Because you can destroy radios, but you cannot destroy the knowledge of how to build them. You can cut communication lines, but you cannot cut the human need to connect. You can impose scarcity, but you cannot make people forget abundance. The snow falls in silence over the Ardennes now, peaceful at last. But in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the faint hiss of static, the crackle of voices reaching across impossible distances, the sound of democracy made audible, imperfect, but undeniably, eternally alive.